is called Carl Jung on the Christian Message, and this is in the form of a letter to Pastor W. Niederer, which was written on October the 1st, 1953. And Dr. Jung this letter also appears in Volume 2 of Letters of C.G. Jung. And so in this letter, Pastor Niederer raised 4 points. And so what I'm going to do is tell you what each point was and then how Dr. Jung responded to it. Point number 1, Jung's intention to make the biblical message intelligible to modern people. And so Dr. Jung says, I will answer your points as best I can in writing. 1, my interest in the first place was to understand the meaning of the Christian message myself. In the second place, to convey this understanding to those of my patients who felt a religious need. And in the third place, to salvage the meaning of Christian symbols in general. Point 2. His critics' conviction that he depersonalized God and made similar misunderstandings. Dr. Jung's response. 2. I don't do anything to God at all. How could I? Sometimes he just cracks me up. I criticize merely our conceptions of God. I have no idea what God is in himself. In my experience, there are only psychic phenomena, which are ultimately of unknown origin, since the psyche in itself is hopelessly unconscious. My critics all ignore the epistemological barrier, which is expressly respected by me. Okay, epistemology is the science of studying the beginnings of philosophy and so on. So Dr. Jung here is referring to his statement that he never says anything about the metaphysical God. Just as everything we perceive is a psychic phenomenon and therefore secondary, so is all inner experience. We should be truly modest and not imagine we can say anything about God himself. Truly, we are confronted with frightful enigmas. We must, in fact, be conscious that an unconscious exists. I don't dare to formulate what the theologian does, but what I do is try to make people conscious enough to know where they can exercise their will and where they are confronted with the power of a non-ego. So far as I can observe the workings of this non-ego, it is possible for me to make statements about it. I have no real cognitive means, only arbitrary decisions, which would enable me to distinguish the unknowable non-ego from what men since the remotest times have called God or gods, etc. For instance, the supreme archetype of the self has a symbolism identical with the traditional Christian God image. How all this can be understood without a knowledge of the psychology of the unconscious or without self-knowledge is utterly beyond me. In psychology, one understands only what one has experienced. The archetype is the ultimate I can know of the inner world. This knowledge denies nothing else that might be there. Point 3, the problem of the archetype in relation to God's power. Okay, so that's what Pastor Niederer had raised. 3, if one assumes that God affects the psychic background and activates it or actually is it, then the archetypes are, so to speak, organs or tools of God. The self functions like the Christ image. This is the theological Christus in Nobis. Christus in Nobis means Christ among us. So I'll reread that bit. The self functions like the Christ image. This is the theological Christus in Nobis, Christ in ourselves. It is not only I who think this way, but all of the ancients right back to Paul. I take my stand clearly on the empirical plane and speak a psychological language, where the theologian speaks an analogous theological or mythological language. Of course, theological statements about the Christian eon do not agree at all points with psychological empiricism. For instance, in regard to God as the summum bonum, or Christ as a one-sided pneumatic light figure. But everything that is alive changes. It even develops so that Christianity is no longer what it was 1,000, let alone 1,900 years ago. It can differentiate itself still further, i.e., go on living, but to do that, it must be interpreted anew in every eon. If that does not happen, it happens even in the Catholic Church, it suffocates in traditionalism. But the foundations, the fundamental psychic facts, remain eternally the same. Point 4, the condemnation of Jung as an a-Christian psychologist of religion by certain narrow-minded theologians. Point 4, here I can only say, O sancta simplicitas, I realize I am fit for the stake ad malorum Dei gloriam. I consider myself a Christian, but that didn't do Savonarola or Servetus much good, and not even Christ himself escaped this fate. Woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. How about these parsons in the true Imitatio Christi? Where are they crucified? They are redeemed scot-free of all pain, and Christ can take care of everything else. And then, with respects to your wife and kind regards, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. So that's the first letter, and I'll welcome any comments you may have.